Hello, and welcome back to Dollar Sense, an Arlington Public News series that looks at all the systems and components that make up our financial system. I'm back again with Joe Camargo from Platinum Wealth Partners. Joe is a portfolio manager and an expert and an expert observer of our financial world, and he will continue to serve as our guide as we work our way through the various aspects of our financial system. And today, Joe, I would love to talk about the Great Recession.
Okay.
And maybe it's clearly something that all of our viewers will be intimately familiar with, since we are barely out of it, or perhaps in some people's perceptions, not even out of it just yet. But for our purposes, let's assume that we're talking about the Great Recession, as I've seen referred to in the papers, as beginning in 2007 and ending in 2009.
Correct.
So can you first of all define for us what is a recession?
A recession is a period of time in which an economy loses economic output. Or in other words, to put it in simplistic terms, it's a period of time over a period of months in which the economy sees some sustained loss in productivity, whether it's products, services, a combination of the two. It's a period where the economy contracts.
Okay, and what are the causes of kinds of things that can cause recessions generally, and then maybe you can speak to what might have caused this one?
Sure. Well, I think to answer that, it's a good idea might be to just kind of go through the fact that a free market system such as ours goes through a series of ebbs and flows, what we refer to as the business cycle or the economic cycle. So first off, a recession, although some might view it as an anomaly, is actually quite common. Since 1948, we've gone through 11. Which works out to roughly one every 6 years, give or take. In terms of what causes a recession, that could be a litany of different things. But generally speaking, when you're looking at a recessionary period, the technical definition is a period in which our economy shrinks for 2 consecutive quarters. Okay, but the definition, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Bureau of Economic Research and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, there are all sorts of different bureaus out there.
All the bureaus.
Right,
yeah.
all the bureaus. They look at recession with a much broader scope, or in a much broader scope, and they don't necessarily adhere to that back-to-back quarterly contraction. Mm-hmm. If you look at the recession that we had in 2001, 2002, technically we were not in a recession. But the Bureau of Economic Research, given that it saw a prolonged period of economic contraction in several different sectors within the economy, they dictate, and they said, look, yes, we are in a recession. So the characteristics or the causes, you see a drop in demand for products, you might have a drop in labor, you might have certain geopolitical events that might take place. Yesterday, for example, there was a change within the leadership in the House of Representatives, and our markets reacted negatively to that, and there's some people that think that the economy might react negatively to that. We'll see. But then there are also some exogenous events, also of a geopolitical nature. You look at the tsunami and the earthquake that Japan went through some years ago, back in 2011, I believe. So that sort of thing can have a very profound impact on an economy, on the overall supply chain, and if it's severe enough, it can bring an economy to a standstill and tip the balance and bring it into a recession. So
Mm-hmm.
there are tons of different causes. Sure.
Another thing that I just wanted to ask you to unravel for us a little
Sure.
bit, if possible, is the fact that it is referred to as the Great Recession in the media and in conversation a lot of the time. Sure. And then we also have something that I'm not sure if we're talking about the same thing or it's different, and that's what's called the financial crisis. Sure. So people refer to the financial crisis, and to me it seems to refer to a much longer period of time. It seems to me that we may still be in the financial crisis. I have that feeling sometimes, and it seems to me my friends do. So can you try and parse that out a little bit for us? Are they the same thing? Or?
I'll do my best. They are and they're not, I think would be the quick answer. The financial crisis that people talk about is, I guess, blended and a direct proxy for the Great Recession. And I guess to better elaborate, this recession that we just went through was massive. This was a recession that affected every corner of the world on some level. It was not a regional event. I think a lot of us, a lot of individuals still see this recession as a U.S.-born recession, as a U.S.-only sort of event. You have parts of Europe that are still looking at a 28%, 26%, 30% unemployment rate. You have Europe, the Eurozone, that just officially exited a recession not once but twice, and that's referred to as a double-dip recession. So it was massive. Right here in the U.S., we lost almost 9 million jobs. We lost 8.7 million jobs, which is more than 4 times than that which we experienced in the recession prior to 2001, 2002, which is very, very modest and very tame relative to this one. So the financial crisis that people talk about was very, very much involved in that. If you think back to 2008, 2009, I remember sitting in my office on days where the equity markets, the Dow, for example, would lose 700, 800 points a day. And I remember people talking about a 15% unemployment rate as being a possibility. I remember people talking about a financial collapse, a financial crisis, our banking system disappearing as we knew it. And the things that come to mind, back then it was a sort of a sky is falling mentality, and which eventually segued into a, oh my God, when will this thing end mentality, to, okay, what sort of recovery are we looking at mentality? And that's where we are right now. But the financial crisis, again, just to bring that into focus, we had several institutions, large institutions, reputable institutions that disappeared. And the fear, again, was that us, the U.S. being the world's financial engine, that it would have a domino effect on other parts of the world. Even though our GDP is, right at present day, is sitting at roughly 16 trillion, the Eurozone, one of our major trading partners, collectively generates about $17 trillion in GDP annually. So what was happening overseas certainly had a direct connection to what was happening here and vice versa.
As I said at the outset, we think about the Great Recession, or it's referred to as having ended in 2009. Even if we say that that's a little bit fuzzy and we push it forward a year or two, whatever, we are obviously not in that place anymore. So we're in a recovery phase, or in some sort of recovery. That's my question.
Okay.
What sort of recovery is this?
We are, the technical jargon, and I alluded to one of them, or a type of recovery. A W-shaped recovery involves an economy going through a recession or contraction, recovering perhaps a little bit too quickly, going back into recession, and then recovering eventually.
That's the situation you described in Europe?
In Europe. That was your double-dip recession. That was and it represents a W-shaped recovery. The U.S. Did not officially go through a double-dip recession. The sort of recovery that we're looking at, and that most economists feel that we have been in over the last 4 years or so, is a U-shaped recovery where the economy contracts. We go through a phase of stability or instability, depending on your point of view, and then eventually recovers in a very modest fashion, forming the shape of a U. That is
not necessarily a symmetrical
correct.
U, I assume. We can go down a lot faster than we can
Absolutely.
come back, perhaps.
Right. And that's exactly what happened. We were looking at a period in time where the U.S. Contracted for 2 or 3 quarters in the average of about 6.5%. We had one quarter where the economy contracted, I believe, 8.9%, and on an annual basis, it contracted about 5%. So that was a very, very sharp drop that we saw, and as you just pointed out quite well, the recovery phase, the growth that we're seeing through GDP, which is how most of us gauge economic growth, or one of the ways in which we gauge economic growth, we're seeing growth in the on an annualized basis in the 2.5%. This past quarter, the economy grew at a 0.1% rate. So that has a lot of people concerned that we're looking at perhaps another recession down the road. It certainly has a lot of people nervous with respect to their savings. But, you know, a lot of folks attribute the lack of productivity, the lack of growth this past quarter to what they're calling the polar vortex, essentially
the weather, basically.
Right? And I think that has some truth to it if you look at comparable numbers overseas. But again, the point is that the recovery relative to other recoveries has been much more modest, much more volatile, much more subject to perception versus economic reality. And that has had a lot of people very, very critical of the jobs that our elected leaders have been able to do thus far. In fairness to them, though, again, this was massive. And it's not something that either the administration or the Congress, in my opinion, had precedents for, had a blueprint for in terms of how to combat this. So you have to give them a mulligan on some level in terms of how they've dealt with the recession. But clearly the growth has been slow, disappointingly slow.
One of the terms I hear a lot is that it is an anemic recovery.
Yes, right.
And I assume that has to do with that slope as we're coming out of it,
Correct.
the slope being very shallow, let's say.
Right.
But does that mean that it is a vulnerable recovery, or does that just mean that it is very slow, not as quick as we would like, but nonetheless, as long as it's heading in that direction, we don't have to worry too much?
I think it depends on who you ask and the sort of data that you're looking at. 2 years ago, if we had been growing at this pace, very, very much susceptible to any sort of economic shock or geopolitical shock. Right now, given the fact that we've added a nice number of jobs, which we may or may not talk about today, a 1% growth within or on a quarter-to-quarter basis, I think is clearly not what we would prefer to see, but I don't think that it's something that can derail this recovery. And as evidence, the Fed over the last 6 months or so has started to taper back its monthly purchases of bonds.
The famous taper, right?
Yes, sir, the taper. Initially, the fact that the Fed, or when the Fed had announced that it was going to start tapering, that had a lot of individuals, a lot of consumers, a lot of corporations very, very nervous. However, when you look at it on its surface, if the Fed thinks that the economy is on a sustainable level enough to start removing or tapering back some of those purchases, that's a very, very positive sign. I think initially people look at that as a negative, but it's similar to one of the analogies that I use is my kids on a bicycle. When they're really young, they are on a set of training wheels, right? And the reason for that is because we generally don't think that they're ready to go off on their own, a safety mechanism. Quantitative easing, which is what our Federal Reserve has been knee-deep in the middle of for years now, it has seen certain inflection points within the economy enough such that, well, maybe we can take these training wheels off. Maybe the economy is strong enough to go off on its own. So I view that as positive.
Well, just as a side note,
Yeah.
we will talk in a future segment much more intensively about Wall Street and the world of finance in that aspect. But it is ironic, just to note, as you say, that something that could be construed as actually good news, which is the Fed observing enough progress in the economy to pull some of that money that it's been throwing at the problem, to pull some of that back, that it would elicit such alarm and such concern among the professionals on Wall Street is just an irony to note for now, and for us to explore more in a future broadcast.
Okay.
But just to get back to a point that you were just mentioning, I think you said earlier that in the Great Recession, we lost 8.7 million jobs, I believe you said. Right. So how many of those are we now, let's say 4 years, 5 years into the recovery, how many of those jobs have we gotten back? Okay. And what does the employment picture look like now?
That's a great question. Last week, a lot was made of the fact that we had now officially made back all 8.7 million jobs that had been lost over essentially an 18-month period. And by jobs lost, for the viewers, we're talking about net jobs. So if, for example, the economy adds 100,000 jobs over different sectors and 40,000 individuals are let go over that same time period, the net job growth for the month is 60,000. Mm-hmm. So the net job losses over the Great Recessionary period was 8.7 million. And in fact, we've added north of 2 million jobs each of the last 3 years, which is very, very encouraging. Last month, 288,000 jobs, or actually I should say the month prior, 288,000 jobs were added. Last week, May's numbers were reported, and we added, I believe, 217. So very constructive. Obviously, there are issues with respect to the economy. There's a lot of criticism with respect to the sort of jobs that are being created.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because you said it was encouraging, and it certainly sounds as if it is. When you think, well, we've actually gotten back to the point we were in by some measure of employment from before the crisis, and yet out there on the street, I think you know as well as I do, people aren't feeling greatly encouraged and confident just yet, it doesn't seem, especially as it relates to jobs. So what explains that discrepancy?
Well, I think a couple of things. In my personal and professional opinion, I think that the economy is going through a structural shift. Having talked to you briefly, there is a transition from our being a manufacturing-based society into a service-based society. A lot of the jobs that were lost in 2008, 2009 were more industrial, were more manufacturing.
On the manufacturing side.
Exactly. A lot of the jobs
factories and
correct. If you look at the auto sector, for example, a lot of those jobs that were lost aren't coming back anytime soon. So I think that the administration and the Congress have a very real challenge in terms of retraining a lot of the individuals that are out there. But that aside, the fact that we have added 8.7 million jobs is absolutely a positive. But to understand what's really going on, you have to peel back the layers. And when you peel back the layers, you understand that some of these jobs aren't paying what they were paying pre-recession. Mm-hmm. A lot of the jobs are not providing the benefits that were available pre-recession. So there's a very real difference in terms of, John Jones working in 2007 versus him working in 2014. He might be working, he might be receiving benefits, but the pay is generally less and the benefits are generally less. And both on an aggregate level have had a profound impact on the discretionary spending that they could go out and participate in, whether it's going out to the movies or just enjoying life. When you take those sort of things away from the general public, the average consumer, the average perception is that the economy is not strong.
And particularly also that the labor market or the labor situation continues to be, again, not that encouraging in some ways.
Well, absolutely. In some ways, you look at, for example, I mentioned the labor participation rate, which is at a 40-year low. Again, I think part of that is structural. You have a society that's aging, and you, as a result, you have more of those baby boomers that are off in retirement. But in fairness, I think a lot of those individuals were forced into retirement, given the macroeconomic environment. So that's a very real issue. I think last month the number was in the 62% range, 62.8 if I'm not mistaken.
What number is that? So
what that does is it's a percentage of the number of individuals that are ready, willing, and able to work. 63% of
those individuals are in fact
actually working.
Wow.
Yeah. Although, again, in fairness, that number has been dropping for 40 years. And just 10 years ago, we were at roughly 65, 66%. So it's not as though we were at some very lofty number and, that number
this
just
has
tanked.
Dropped precipitously, right?
It's been a very gradual drop over 3 decades. And then as the Great Recession really took hold, we had a massive drop, very precipitous drop.
One other aspect of the whole labor question or situation that I was wondering about is we hear about the unemployment rate. We hear about it all the time. Right. And my understanding is that it's at 6.3% or something like that currently. But I'm also aware that there's an underemployment rate. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. The underemployment rate, which is a much more comprehensive number and I think a much more accurate number, had...
and when you say accurate, you mean in terms of reflecting what the situation is really like for
and reflecting a broader audience or a broader demographic. You're looking at individuals who are still officially looking for work or are working, but are working in a profession that's not their own profession, or they're individuals whose hours have been cut back, or are working on a part-time basis just to survive. So that number right now stands at, I believe, 12.2%, certainly off of its highs from 2010, but still very elevated. So when I'm looking at that, at the unemployment metric, I think that it's a nice metric to look at, but the much more accurate, much more telling number is the underemployment number, which the government refers to as the U6 number. The last thing that I would say is, and I think I've alluded to this, is that they've both dropped. The overall trend is downward sloping. And even though that, I guess what I'm not saying is that the economy certainly is not operating on all 8 cylinders, to use an expression. However, the consensus that job growth is anemic, that the economy really isn't growing, is inaccurate to a very large degree, because you do have to look at a much broader scope of economic metrics, and the metrics that I follow on a very regular basis are actually quite good.
With the time that remains for us, I think what I'd like to concentrate on is asking you, what in your, as a professional, again, who makes it his business to closely observe what's going on, what are the effects of the recession and coming out of it on consumers, on individuals, and also on business?
Okay.
How are they similar and how are they different?
Sure. I think the effects in this case are long-lasting. There's been a great deal of discussion involving this recovery that we're in, and the fact that it's anemic relative to other recoveries, which is true to an extent, without peeling back the layers, as I said. Consumers from a spending standpoint, from an investing standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, were incredibly impacted and are still very, very much so reluctant to invest, for example, given the scope of the bear market that we were in 4 years ago. Spending, interesting dichotomy, so to speak. There's a great deal of talk out there that consumers are not spending and that they've refused to spend for years and years and years now. But the data refutes that. People are spending. One of the things that I've learned over the years is to watch what consumers are doing versus what they are saying. Mm-hmm. And a very interesting observation that one can make is to go to a mall on a typically non-shopping night, a Tuesday night, maybe a Wednesday night, and see how full the parking lot is. See what sort of traffic is going through the mall itself. When we were at the height of this past recession, on a Tuesday night, nobody was there. Mm-hmm. And you could see it. I would drive by the South Shore Plaza on a very regular basis, and on those nights, there was nobody there. Much different story now. So from an investing standpoint, people are starting to get encouraged, and yet I would caution against perhaps going too heavy on the equity side, given the enormous bull market that we've been in. Mm-hmm.
Another topic.
Another topic, well. Right. On the spending side, I think that consumers are in fact spending on discretionary items, not just the staples, mm-hmm. But on the appliances, on the durable goods, on the vacations.
Which probably is a good sign, right?
Absolutely.
If I understand everything that I hear, which is we are a consumer-driven economy at this point. So if consumers, however it is that they are talking about their spending habits, if what we're observing is that in fact they're out there and spending their money in the malls and stores, et cetera, that's got to be a good thing.
It is a good thing, and they are spending more than the general perception has allowed for. Not as much as I would like to see it, as most of us would like to see, but certainly not anemic spending on any level. On the business side, there are some very positive signs that the business sector has started to engage in what's called capital spending, and in fact has started to hire at the rate that we would like to see for a more sustainable recovery. The number of jobless claims has dropped precipitously since 2009, precipitously. But the job growth, as many people complain about, it isn't there. And on certain levels, the quality of the job certainly isn't there. But just going back to the original point, the business sector clearly, given the scope of the recession, very reluctant to hire, very reluctant to spend. Now that we're seeing some pockets in certain sectors and some very real growth in others, the hope, the anticipation for the second part of this year is that perhaps we've crossed that threshold and businesses will in fact start to open up and put some capital spending in play and really grow this economy.
Well, with that, I can say with confidence that I have, again, learned a whole boatload in this conversation with you today, and I'm hopeful and confident again that our audience has done the same. So thanks, Joe, for joining us.
Thank you for having me again.
And we look forward to seeing you again next time. And also thank you for joining us here at Dollar Cents, and we look forward to seeing you next time as well. Thank you.